everyone. A very warm welcome to the Post-Kantian philosophy seminar. I'm Dr. Joshua Brogy. I'm the founder of Woolf, which is an academic organization running across a number of different disciplines and also a degree granting institution in Europe and now in the United States as well. Really, it's a great pleasure to introduce Stephen and Adrian. Stephen has been running this seminar and organizing it. There are future lectures posted at seminars.woolf.university. There's a forthcoming lineup there. I'm just here to kick off the year. I'm really grateful that Adrian has been willing to give this talk, and I hope it's a really rich conversation. I know it's a great paper that he's reading. And so looking forward to all the conversations that will come out of it. With those minor introductory comments, over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Joshua. Thank you all for being here today. The last I checked, there were 64 people registered for this session. So that means I think for many of you, this will be your first time attending a Woolf Public Seminar in our Post-Kantian philosophies series. The seminar meets monthly. Ordinarily, the format is for our speaker to deliver a talk of anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour, followed by a discussion. And typically the discussion would be permitting follow-ups, but in the interest of time, because there's so many people at today's event, what I'm going to request is if you have a question for our speaker, pose the question once the talk is over in the chat, and I will read through the questions in the order in which they're received. And we'll do our very best to get to as many of those questions as we can. The title of today's talk is Armchair Knowledge, Some Kantian Reflections. Our speaker, Professor A.W. Moore, is a member of the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Oxford, and he's a tutorial fellow at St. Hugh's College, Oxford. Some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar that since 2015, Professor Moore has been joint editor of Mind with Lucy O'Brien, but he's better known for his work, which ranges over a vast number of issues, including Kant, Wittgenstein, the history of philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of mathematics, the philosophy of language, ethics, and philosophy of religion as well. He's also the author of a number of monographs. I think his first book was published in 1990. That was entitled The Infinite, and that formed the basis of a BBC4 radio program in 2016. It's now a work that's in its third edition. In 1997, he published Points of View, which is a really excellent book. Then that was followed by Noble in Reason, Infinite in Faculty, Themes and Variations in Kant's Moral and Religious Philosophy. And then in 2012, he published a massive book called The Evolution of Modern Metaphysics, Making Sense of Things. It's a fantastic work. Highly recommend you read it if you haven't yet already. And then more recently, he's published two books with OUP, the first of which was published in 2019. That was entitled Language, World, and Limits, Essays in the Philosophy of Language and Metaphysics. And then just last year, he published Gödel's Theorem, a very short introduction. So without further ado, turn it over to Adrian, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen, for that kind introduction, and also for the invitation to give this talk today. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen with you because I have a two-page handout. It's not very extensive, but I shall be referring to this from time to time. I should begin by confessing that this is a long paper. That's the bad news. The good news is that I'm not going to be reading all of the paper. It's in 7 sections, and I'll just be reading the first 5 sections. But I'm mentioning this at the outset because it's just possible that when we get to the Q&A after the paper, that I will find myself from time to time saying, oh, well, that's something that I get onto in the later sections of the paper. But we'll see how that goes. As I say, I'll just be focusing attention on the first 5 sections of the paper. And section number 1 is entitled A Kantian View of Armchair Knowledge. Now, one of the oldest of philosophical puzzles is to account for what I shall call armchair knowledge. And by armchair knowledge, as you see on the handout, I mean knowledge that is independent of experience, in the sense that it's not warranted by experience. The rationale for the label is clear enough. Given any such knowledge, the subject could have had it while remaining seated in an armchair. At least given the concepts involved, it's possible that acquisition of those concepts required the subject to leave the armchair, but otherwise they didn't need to leave the armchair. Now, I could just as well have used the more familiar label a priori knowledge. But a priori knowledge, that label is sometimes used more broadly, not just to apply to knowledge that is independent of experience, but to knowledge that could have been independent of experience. So, for example, my own knowledge that every natural number is the sum of 4 squares doesn't count as armchair knowledge because it's based on an appeal to authority. But it does count as a priori knowledge in this broader sense. So I hope that my use of the less familiar label, along with this stipulative definition of it, helps to avoid confusion on that score. And I also hope that it helps to highlight a crucial feature, or at least what appears to be a crucial feature of such knowledge. It doesn't involve any particular encounter, it doesn't involve any appeal to any particular encounter with anything beyond the subject. And the puzzle about such knowledge to which I've referred arises from the fact that not only does there appear to be such knowledge, but some of it appears to concern what is beyond the subject. And the question is, how can it, given that what is beyond the subject is irrelevant to it in that way? And the puzzle is exacerbated by the fact that some of the knowledge in question appears to concern not just some of what is beyond the subject, but all of what is beyond the subject. And indeed, not just all of what is beyond the subject, but all of what could possibly be beyond the subject. So, to repeat, the puzzle arises because each of the following appears to be the case. And again, you'll see that this is on the handout. Proposition number 1, there is armchair knowledge. Proposition number 2, some armchair knowledge, if such there be, concerns what is beyond the subject. And proposition number 3, armchair knowledge doesn't involve any appeal to any particular encounter with anything beyond the subject. And they look as if they're in tension with each other, those 3 propositions. Now, some philosophers think that the puzzle can be solved by denying the appearances, denying that these 3 things that appear to be true really are true. So, for example, certain empiricists simply deny proposition 1. Other empiricists accept 1 but deny 2. And what they say is that armchair knowledge concerns the subject's command of language or the subject's conceptual repertoire or something of that kind. And certain Platonists accept 1 and 2, but deny 3. And they say that the armchair knowledge is acquired through and involves appeal to acquaintance with one or more Platonic ideal or universal or something of that kind. But there are philosophers who think that the puzzle can be solved without denying the appearances. They accept 1, 2, and 3. And the way in which they solve the puzzle is by espousing some version of idealism, whereby, you see the definition on the handout, some of what the subject has knowledge of, including in this version, some of what is beyond the subject, has a form, a range of essential features that depends on the subject. And the armchair knowledge in question pertains to this form. So some of it is knowledge to the effect that whatever has the form is of such and such a kind. Some of it is knowledge to the effect that whatever is of such and such a kind has the form. And this means that it does indeed concern what is beyond the subject, because the form is the form of what is beyond the subject. But it also means that the knowledge doesn't involve any particular appeal to any particular encounter with anything beyond the subject, precisely because the form to which the knowledge pertains depends on the subject. And this, I take it, is Kant's view. And its attractions are not confined to the fact that it can be used to account for armchair knowledge of what is beyond the subject. It can also be used, if Kant is right, to account for some knowledge of what is necessary. Kant's own view being that armchair knowledge simply qua armchair knowledge is knowledge of what is necessary. Indeed, it can be used to account for some knowledge of what is necessary as necessary. So if some of the armchair knowledge in question is knowledge to the effect that whatever has the given form is of such and such a kind, then some of it is also, in Kant's view, knowledge to the effect that whatever has the form must be of such and such a kind. And how to account for knowledge of what is necessary as necessary is another old philosophical puzzle. And the puzzle this time arises from the sheer fact that we finite, contingent creatures that we are can have epistemic access to all the ways in which things might have been. And many philosophers think that they can solve this puzzle, or at least that they can begin to solve this puzzle, by finding a grounding for necessity in contingency, where finding a grounding for necessity in contingency is more than simply discovering with respect to some apparent necessity that there is a contingency underpinning it, so that it no longer appears as necessary. Doing that is not especially remarkable, and nor does it have any great philosophical purchase. In fact, doing that is just an important part of growing up. But finding a grounding for necessity in contingency is doing something more delicate than that. It's discovering, with respect to some apparent necessity, that there is a contingency underpinning it without disrupting the appearance of necessity. And this, if it can be done at all, does have philosophical purchase. And it's one of the things that Kant tries to do. Kant espouses a version of idealism whereby that part of the subject's armchair knowledge which pertains to the given form is knowledge from a particular point of view. And a point of view, by its very nature, admits of alternatives. So the fact that there is knowledge from this point of view is the relevant contingency, the contingency in which the relevant necessity is grounded. But Kant doesn't think that the necessity is thereby compromised, because he doesn't think that there's anything in his idealism to preclude the subjects continuing to have and continuing to exercise knowledge from the given point of view. It's just that such knowledge can't itself include acknowledgement of the idealism. And so this explains why Kant's idealism is, in his own terminology, transcendental idealism rather than empirical idealism. Kant uses these two terms to register a distinction between two views about the nature of space and time. But for our purposes, it will be helpful to extend his usage and to work with a broader distinction. So, appealing back to the handout, the definition of I-dependence, let's refer to the dependence posited by the idealist, the dependence of the form of what the subject has knowledge of on the subject. Let's refer to that as the I-dependence. Then, and here are the next two definitions on the handout, we can construe transcendental idealism as idealism in which the I-dependence is not itself included in whatever has this form, and we can construe empirical idealism as idealism in which it is included. And the reason why Kant's idealism is transcendental is that it assigns contingency to the I-dependence, because it allows that there might never have been any such subject, nor therefore any such form depending on the subject. And this contingency, simply qua contingency, must transcend the necessity attendant on whatever has the form in question. Section 2, which is entitled The Distinction Between Analytic Armchair Knowledge and Synthetic Armchair Knowledge, and two associated questions. Now, Kant famously distinguishes between two kinds of armchair knowledge, that which is analytic and that which is synthetic. And this distinction is related to another that he draws between intuitions and concepts. Intuitions are products of the subject's receptivity. There's something passive about them. Concepts are products of the subject's spontaneity. There's something active about them. It's by means of intuitions that the subject is given various objects of knowledge. It's by means of concepts that the subject thinks about these objects as thus given. And any knowledge, at least if it has what Kant calls content, must make use of both. It must involve an exercise of concepts whereby something is thought, but these concepts must in turn ultimately relate to intuitions, whereby whatever is thought has whatever content it has. What distinguishes analytic knowledge is that in this case, the exercise of concepts does all the relevant work. The subject knows simply by appeal to the concepts involved, and in particular by analysis of them, that what is being thought is true. And so an example would be the subject's knowledge that all vixens are female. By contrast, in the case of synthetic knowledge, the subject also appeals to the intuitions involved. And again, you'll see the definition of analytic and synthetic armchair knowledge on the handout. Now, does it follow that no analytic armchair knowledge testifies to proposition number 2 in the original puzzle? In other words, that no armchair knowledge that is analytic concerns what is beyond the subject. Well, it looks as though it does follow, because it looks as though what analytic armchair knowledge concerns on this view is the subject's conceptual repertoire. In fact, however, I don't think that we're forced to say this. I think there is a perfectly good sense of concern in which the subject's analytic armchair knowledge that all vixens are female concerns vixens, not the subject's concept of a vixen, nor any other part of the subject's conceptual repertoire. There's a perfectly good sense of concern, in other words, in which it concerns what is beyond the subject. But whether or not we adopt this attenuated sense of concern and say that some analytic armchair knowledge concerns what is beyond the subject, there are 2 associated questions that arise. And we can begin to appreciate the force of these questions by noting that to whatever extent it is appropriate to say that some analytic armchair knowledge concerns what is beyond the subject, to that extent, it is likewise appropriate to regard such knowledge as part of the original puzzle. The puzzle which Kant tries to solve by invoking transcendental idealism, or rather the puzzle part of which Kant tries to solve by invoking transcendental idealism. For although Kant holds that transcendental idealism is needed to solve the puzzle with respect to synthetic armchair knowledge, he also holds that it's needed to solve the puzzle only with respect to synthetic armchair knowledge. And whatever his reasons for holding this, they weren't apparent in anything that I said in the previous section. So the 2 questions that arise are these, and again, you'll see them on the handout. Question number 1, would Kant allow that transcendental idealism can be invoked to solve the puzzle with respect to analytic armchair knowledge too, even if it doesn't have to be? And question number 2, what is it about synthetic armchair knowledge that makes Kant think that transcendental idealism must be invoked to solve the puzzle with respect to it? Those are the 2 questions. So section number 3 will address question number 1 and is entitled Invoking Transcendental Idealism to Account for Analytic Armchair Knowledge. So let's begin with question 1. Well, Kant certainly thinks that the puzzle with respect to analytic armchair knowledge can be solved without recourse to transcendental idealism. It's enough, Kant thinks, to note that the subject can have such knowledge just by analysing the concepts involved. So in effect, Kant is saying that even if analytic armchair knowledge does concern what is beyond the subject, the sense in which it does so is sufficiently attenuated that there's no need in accounting for such knowledge to relate the form of what the subject has knowledge of to the subject in any way. Still less any need to acknowledge the I dependence, and still less to acknowledge the I dependence in such a way that some of the subject's knowledge is to be seen as knowledge from a particular point of view that admits of alternatives. There's no need to do any of that. But the question is whether Kant would have any quarrel with a philosopher who, perhaps in an attempt to give a unified account of all armchair knowledge, does do this. So let's imagine a philosopher who urges that the form of what is beyond the subject, which depends on the subject, and to which the subject's armchair knowledge all pertains, is not confined to those of its essential features that Kant famously fastens on, its spatiotemporality, its subjection to causal laws, etc., but also extends to all those of its essential features that are in any way conceptual, such as the feature of being, if a vixen, then female. And let's suppose that this philosopher also urges that the contingency of the I dependence is no less a mark of the subject's general conceptualization of things than it is of the subject's spatiotemporal intuition of things. Such a philosopher doesn't need to disagree with Kant when Kant says that in order to have analytic armchair knowledge, the subject need only analyze the concepts involved, because this extension of Kant's transcendental idealism might be intended as an explication of that fact, not as a challenge to it. And so the question, to repeat, is whether Kant would have any quarrel with such a philosopher. Well, in fact, yes, I think he would. And the reason that I think he would is that Kant holds that the subject can have thoughts concerning things in themselves, thoughts concerning things irrespective of how they are given to us. So one very basic and very famous example is the thought that God exists. And a philosopher who holds that the subject's conceptualization of things contributes as much to the contingency of the I dependence as the subject's spatiotemporal intuition of things must, in Kant's view, hold that the subject's thinking, no less than the subject's intuiting, is always of appearances, never of things in themselves. So yes, Kant would have a quarrel with this philosopher. But to say that Kant would have a quarrel with this philosopher is not, of course, to say that Kant would be justified in having it. And the question remains, what error in Kant's own terms, such a philosopher would be committing, and why Kant isn't forced to conclude, again in his own terms, albeit contrary to his own conviction, that the subject's thinking is always of appearances, never of things in themselves. We can put it this way: when Kant argues from the existence of armchair knowledge concerning what is beyond the subject to the truth of transcendental idealism, at what point in his argument does he make crucial appeal to the fact that the armchair knowledge is synthetic? And relatedly, what is it in his own terms that would preclude someone extending the argument to armchair knowledge that is analytic? And it seems to me that this question is surprisingly unstraightforward. It is true that in Kant's presentation of his argument, there are frequent appeals to the fact that the armchair knowledge is synthetic. But if the argument were reworked to eliminate these appeals, it's not obvious what would prevent it from continuing to meet with success. Or rather, it's not obvious what would prevent it from continuing to meet with whatever success it meets with in the first place. Now, here are two things that Kant might say at this point. First, he might say that his own argument for transcendental idealism is an inference to the best explanation. In fact, an inference to the only possible explanation. And that what would prevent it from meeting with the same success, if extended to analytic armchair knowledge, is the fact that although it would still be an inference to an explanation of how we can have such knowledge, it wouldn't any longer be an inference to the best explanation, because the simpler explanation involving nothing but the subject's analysis of the concepts involved would still be available. And a second thing that Kant might say is that not only does he want to allow for thoughts about things in themselves, which the extended version of his argument would rule out, but he's obliged to allow for thoughts about things in themselves. Otherwise, to quote Kant himself, there would follow the absurd proposition that there is an appearance without anything that appears. But neither of these responses seems to me entirely satisfactory. The first, about inference to the best explanation, that may just beg crucial questions about the relative virtues of rival explanations. So why do the unity and the power of an explanation that applies to all armchair knowledge, why doesn't that count for more than the simplicity of an explanation that applies just to analytic armchair knowledge? And admittedly, there would be an obvious answer to this question if the first response were buttressed by the second. Kant's need to acknowledge thoughts about things in themselves. But that second response may beg crucial questions of its own about the very coherence of Kant's transcendental idealism. If the extended version of the argument leads to a contradiction, it may be a contradiction that Kant is destined eventually to be led to anyway. Well, these are enormous issues, and I'm not going to say any more about them at this juncture, although I will briefly return to the coherence of transcendental idealism in the final section. But now what I want to do is to take a slight detour that will bring us back to question number 2 on the handout. And so this brings us to section 4, which is entitled Invoking Transcendental Idealism to Account for Synthetic Armchair Knowledge. Now, we've seen that one of the attractions of Kant's transcendental idealism is that it accounts for some knowledge of what is necessary as necessary. And it does so by locating a grounding for the necessity in contingency. But there are views other than transcendental idealism, indeed, views that are not versions of idealism at all, that have a title to the same claim. So consider, for example, the view according to which the subject's knowledge that all vixens are female consists in command of a particular rule of representation, namely a rule that prohibits calling a creature a vixen without also counting that creature as female. Now, as before, there's an issue about whether such knowledge can be said to concern what is beyond the subject in whatever attenuated sense, or whether it's better described as concerning the subject's conceptual repertoire or something of that sort. But be that as it may, there's certainly a sense in which it's knowledge of a contingency, because there might never have been any such rule, at least not if rules are construed as social institutions, which is how I am construing them. But the necessity is not in any way thereby compromised. Because if there had never been any such rule, vixens would not have failed to be female. Rather, what sex vixens are would not have been an issue for anyone. Nobody would have thought in those terms. Vixens would not have failed to be female because vixens must be female. And this must is as hard as it either can be or need be. Now, any view of this kind, any Wittgensteinian view, as I shall say, although I'm not going to make any attempt here to justify the exegesis, any Wittgensteinian view would be a variant of Kant's view of analytic armchair knowledge. There would be differences, to be sure. Indeed, there would be differences large enough for it to count as a rival view. But there would also be a clear family resemblance, which there definitely would not be where Kant's view of synthetic armchair knowledge is concerned. And in exploring why not, we shall be helped on our way towards an answer to question number 2. On a Wittgensteinian view, there's a clear sense in which, given any item of knowledge to which the view applies, such as the knowledge that all vixens are female, sheer familiarity with the concepts involved ensures that one can see the truth of what is known. But on Kant's view of synthetic armchair knowledge, there's no clear sense in which, given any item of knowledge to which the view applies, sheer familiarity with the concepts involved ensures that one can see the truth of what is known. Precisely not. Kant insists that we can't see the truth of what is known in such a case without appeal to the intuitions involved. What Kant would accept, even in such a case, is that sheer familiarity with the concepts involved ensures that one can see how things must be for what is known to be true. In other words, it ensures that one can see not the truth of what is known, but the truth conditions of what is known. And this is in contrast with the logical form of what is known, which leaves the truth conditions of what is known undetermined. And this in turn explains why, if one wanted to show that what is known is not an analytic truth, one could not avail oneself of any analogue of a procedure that would be available to show that what is known is not a logical truth. If you wanted to show that what is known is not a logical truth, you could specify a false proposition with the same logical form. If you wanted to show that what is known is not an analytic truth, by contrast, you'd have to reckon with alternatives to that very truth. And of course, this means that as far as the concepts involved are concerned, there had better be alternatives to that very truth. So let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that the truth in question is that the sum of the angles in a triangle add up to 2 right angles. Well then, there had better be alternatives in which the sum of the angles in a triangle is something other than 2 right angles. If no such alternative existed, and I really do mean if no such alternative existed, not just if no such alternative were realized, then no such alternative would remain to be ruled out by anyone familiar with the concepts involved. And so then there would be a sense, a clear sense, in which sheer familiarity with the concepts involved would ensure that one could see the truth of what is known. But now I think we are within sight of an answer to question number 2 about why Kant thinks that transcendental idealism is needed to solve the original puzzle with respect to synthetic armchair knowledge. On Kant's view, synthetic armchair knowledge, simply qua-synthetic, is knowledge of a truth that admits of alternatives in the way just outlined. But qua-armchair, it's knowledge of a truth that in some sense admits of no alternatives. It is knowledge somehow of both a contingency and a necessity. Now, so too, as we've seen, is the subject's knowledge that all vixens are female on the Wittgensteinian view. The difference is that in the Wittgensteinian case, there doesn't even appear to be any conflict between the contingency and the necessity. The necessity attaches to the known truth itself, that vixens are female. The contingency attaches to the second order truth that there is a rule in force whose statement consists in an enunciation of that first order truth. The relevant alternatives are not alternatives to vixens being female. They are alternatives to that rule being in force, and hence to anyone having any thoughts about vixens. But on Kant's view of synthetic armchair knowledge, the relevant alternatives are alternatives to the known truth itself. In the example that we were considering, they're alternatives to triangles having angles that sum to 2 right angles. So in the Kantian case, there does appear to be a conflict between the contingency and the necessity. And the only way in which Kant can see to resolve this apparent conflict is by introducing some appropriate relativization. He holds that the truth in question is necessary from a particular point of view, the very point of view that the subject's knowledge is from, constituted in part by the intuitions to which the subject appeals in having this knowledge. But when the truth is not considered from that point of view, when a step back is taken to reflect on why appeal to these intuitions are necessary to have knowledge of the truth, which is done by not appealing to them, but rather by prescinding from them, then Kant thinks that the truth can be conceived as admitting of alternatives. And to make this work, and in particular to explain how the subject can have armchair knowledge of what admits of such alternatives, Kant espouses an idealism whereby the necessity in question itself depends on the subject, and this is the I dependence. But the idealism in question has to be transcendental idealism. The I dependence has to be conceived as transcending the necessity in question, because it can't be so much as entertained until that step back is taken from the original point of view. Both on Kant's view and on the Wittgensteinian view, then, there is an attempt of sorts to ground necessity in contingency. But on Kant's view, unlike on the Wittgensteinian view, the attempt assumes the form that it is peculiarly given by transcendental idealism, so as to allay what would otherwise be a simple conflict between a claim of necessity and a claim of contingency with respect to one and the same truth. Now, you'll be relieved to hear that we're almost there. There's just one section remaining, and it's a brief section, but it is also entitled The Incoherence of Transcendental Idealism. So a brief section in which I sketch some of my concerns about where Kant ends up. So far, Kant has been vindicated, at least as far as question number 2 is concerned, or at least he has been vindicated up to a point. But I think that point comes quite quickly. And in fact, it's a point that I anticipated a little bit earlier in my discussion of question number 1, when I alluded to the possibility that Kant is destined eventually to lapse into contradiction, given the way in which he allows us thoughts about things in themselves. And I think we're beginning to witness such a lapse. And the reason for this is the step back that we've been considering is not a shift from considering things from one point of view to considering them from another. It's a shift from considering things from one point of view to considering them from no point of view at all. From thinking about how things appear to thinking about how they are in themselves. Now, this would be all very well if such thinking were only ever mere thinking. I don't see Kant as involved in any internal inconsistency simply in allowing us thoughts about things in themselves. The problem is that by Kant's own lights, such thinking sometimes amounts to knowledge. So let's consider, for example, his own thought that there is synthetic armchair knowledge, which can't be accounted for except by appeal to the distinctive I dependence that is the hallmark of transcendental idealism. Well, by his own lights, this is a piece of knowledge. The knowledge that there is synthetic armchair knowledge. It's a piece of knowledge, if only because he has arrived at it as a result of what he takes to be a decisive argument. And indeed, not just a piece of knowledge, but a piece of synthetic armchair knowledge. Because Kant would surely deny that it depends on sheer analysis of the concepts involved. So it's not analytic. And he would surely deny that it depends on experience. So it is armchair. So the upshot is that Kant is, by his very own lights, forced to accede to the very thing that it is his business to deny, namely synthetic armchair knowledge of how things are in themselves. And if this is right, then it means that Kant does eventually lapse into contradiction. Nothing here invalidates the argument that he advances from the existence of synthetic armchair knowledge to the truth of transcendental idealism. That's the Kantian conditional at the bottom of the handout. When I claimed earlier that as far as question 2 is concerned, Kant is vindicated up to a point, precisely what I had in mind was the validity of this argument. The crux, however, is that we can acknowledge the validity of this argument without lapsing into the same contradiction, because we don't have to conclude that transcendental idealism is true. Where Kant applies a modus ponens, we can apply a modus tollens instead and conclude that there is no such thing as synthetic armchair knowledge. This may be because there's no armchair knowledge at all, or it may be because all armchair knowledge is analytic, or it may be because there's something wrong with the very distinction between analytic armchair knowledge and synthetic armchair knowledge, or it may be for one of a number of other reasons. But whatever the explanation, something somewhere must give. Thanks very much. That's the end of the talk.
Thank you, Adrian. That was fantastic. I'm sure there's going to be a lot to discuss. My thought is that while those in the audience gather their thoughts and formulate whatever questions they may have for you in the chat, I'll just kick things off by asking a question of my own. I'm not sure how useful this question will be, but I want to maybe try to simplify things a bit by going back to like the sort of basic presentation of Kant that one might get in a sort of undergraduate introductory course. And so the way that I was sort of introduced to these ideas initially was just that to say that the sort of knowledge that Kant is after is armchair knowledge is to say, as you have, that it's in some sense universal or necessary. And then to say that it's synthetic is to just add the further point that it's not merely conceptual or definitional, but it's actually true of experience. And I'm wondering, some of Kant's critics that come later, people like Husserl, for example, criticize Kant on the grounds that Kant's form of transcendental idealism that is meant to kind of secure that sort of knowledge, synthetic armchair knowledge, amounts to like what Husserl will call a form of transcendental psychologism. And so there's this worry that, well, even if we grant that in a way, the knowledge that Kant takes to deliver is universal and necessary, it's not as absolute as a certain sort of philosopher might wish to be the case. There's some kind of deficit still involved. It's a kind of relativism. So I'm wondering whether you see something to this concern of transcendental psychologism and how Kant might try to go about addressing that concern. And the kind of corollary to this is, to what extent do you think this potential problem in Kant is due to the conditions of possibility for such knowledge being in the mind, as it were? I know that Kant is very careful to try to emphasize that he's not doing psychology, but in some sense, it's difficult to understand how we are to understand these sort of conditions insofar as they're subjective, if they're not in the mind in a more kind of traditional sense. So I'm wondering if you can maybe say something as well about Kant's own understanding of the distinction between what he is attempting to offer as a form of transcendental inquiry and what psychology or anthropology is offering. Thanks.
Good. Well, thanks ever so much for that question, Stephen. I think that's a great question and gets to the heart of the matter, actually, and I think chimes with some of the things that I was trying to say myself. I mean, as far as the idea that there's a kind of relativization involved here, as far as that idea is concerned, that the things that we're accepting as necessary are ultimately only necessary in a kind of relative way rather than a kind of absolute way. As far as that's concerned, I think there's a sense in which Kant would be happy to simply concede that, but not to hear it as an objection. So I don't think Kant would resist the relativization move, but I do think that he would feel that he was able to accommodate it. So, for example, as we all know, a lot of his story about the things that are necessary consists in a story about the nature of space and time, our forms of intuition. And Kant is happy to leave open at least the epistemic possibility that there are finite creatures with completely different forms of sensibility from ours. So the necessity that attaches to things being spatiotemporal in the way that they are then does become a necessity only for creatures that intuit things in the way that we do. And so then this leads naturally into your second question, Stephen, which is, to what extent does that mean that whether he likes it or not, he's doing a kind of psychology? Well, it's certainly not psychology in any sense that's familiar to us or would have been familiar to Kant himself for that matter. And in particular, of course, it's not the kind of psychology that involves investigating contingent features of how the mind works. But there is a sense in which it's an investigation of the mind, because apart from anything else, when all said and done, these forms of intuition are part of the a priori structure of what we might call the mind. Although, of course, when we talk about the mind, the sort of relativization that we were just discussing kicks in again, and we have to acknowledge that that may not be absolutely any finite, rational mind. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but as I say, I think what you're doing in posing that question is tapping into precisely the sorts of issues that I was trying to discuss in the paper.
Yeah, no, that certainly does answer the question. I noticed that while you were responding to my question, there was someone who had a hand up. I think the size of the gathering is such that if people want, they can just raise a hand and I'll call on them. So while people think about that, just a quick follow-up. So you mentioned the forms of intuition, so that creatures such as us, the a priori structure of what you could say perception is what it is. It could be different for creatures that had a different apparatus. And then would something apply as well when it comes to our concepts, so that, for example, like the laws of logic, are we then to say on Kant's view that his idealism implies that there could be laws of logic that are different for creatures that have a different conceptual apparatus than the apparatus that we have?
Well, that is in itself an absolutely fascinating question. And you'll remember that right at the very beginning of this presentation, I said that I was just going to deliver the first 5 sections of a 7-section paper. And in fact, one of the issues that I address in section 6 is that very issue. There are both exegetical and philosophical questions that arise at this point, neither of which are quite as straightforward as you might initially think. And in particular, the question of whether there's the same sort of contingency attaching to our concepts as there is attaching to our forms of intuition is not anything like as exegetically straightforward as people are inclined to think. I know from experience, because I've recently discussed this with a number of people, that opinions divide diametrically on this issue, and there are those who think that Kant would say exactly the same about the categories as he would say about the forms of intuition. And there are those who think, no, there's a kind of absolute necessity that attaches to the categories. But in fact, closer scrutiny of the texts and further consideration of the philosophical issues show that it's much harder to settle this question than you might think. And it looks as if Kant is deliberately non-committal on it, actually. But let me just say one thing, which is we have to tread very carefully. And in particular, even if we accede to the possibility that there are creatures with different pure concepts from ours, that's not quite the same as saying that there are creatures whose logic is different from ours, if by different is meant incompatible. So, the thought is not, well, for all we know, there are creatures out there for whom P and not P may both be true. And incidentally, I'm not now thinking about Graham Priest and other Australia, sorry, I shouldn't say other Australians. Graham's not Australian. So that's not the thought. The thought is not that there may be creatures out there for whom P and not P may both be true. The thought is rather there may be creatures out there who don't have negation at all. You know, that's not one of their fundamental concepts. So they're just not thinking in these terms. They're not disagreeing with us about the law of the excluded middle. They're just not reckoning with it at all. And for that matter, we've got to be similarly careful where the forms of intuition are concerned. The thought is not, well, for all we know, there are creatures out there whose forms of intuition allow for triangles whose angles sum to something else. Creatures whose spatial intuition is non-Euclidean. I mean, again, in fact, we can turn to other human beings who think that. In fact, we can turn to 20th century physicists who tell us that that is what space is like. But that's not the sort of possibility that Kant would have wanted to reckon with, because, of course, he thought that space was necessarily Euclidean. So when we're envisaging alternatives, we're envisaging creatures who have forms of intuition that are fundamentally different, that are not spatial at all. They may be, I mean, there may be all sorts of really interesting structural and analogues between their forms of intuition and ours, but they're not going to be creatures who are intuiting things spatially, but whose geometry is different. Because I think Kant's story would be, well, if they're intuiting things spatially, then their geometry has got to be the same, because the geometry that we have is the geometry of space.
Good, thanks. I mean, this all gets into these issues about points of view and absolute points of view,
Yeah.
and we can delve into that, I think, later on in the conversation. But I want to turn to a question from the audience. From Graham White. Let's see.
You're muted, Graham.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Yeah, about vixens. It's not an easy concept to define in physicalistic terms, because, you know, we actually don't have good, necessary, and sufficient conditions according to which, you know, those animals' ovaries would function correctly. So I think if you want to look at that in Kantian terms, then, you know, I mean, this really is some sort of example of the synthetic a priori, because, you know, you may have ovaries which, you know, look as if they might work, but which actually don't, because of, you know, very complex malfunctions of biochemistry that we don't even know about in the present state of science. So, and, you know, and I think that really is a very Kantian example in those terms.
I mean, it's a really interesting point that you're making, Graham, and in a way, my answer is quite a cheap answer, which is that okay, well, even if you're right, then it's a bad example, and I just need another example, because there was absolutely nothing in the paper that rested on that particular example.
No, but I think they're very pervasive examples. I mean, biology.
I mean, what would be a problem, obviously, and I don't know whether this is part of what you're getting at, would be if there was something about this example which you know, on the face of it looks as if it's quite a compelling example for an analytic truth, if you believe in the analytic synthetic distinction at all. What would be a problem would be if there was something about this example to suggest that we're never going to be able to satisfactorily identify something as analytic. Because I could well imagine somebody saying, well, look, if you're right, and if there's some reason to be nervous about ascribing analyticity in this case, then when the hell are we going to be able to ascribe it? And that would, and obviously, you know, that would raise fascinating questions in its own right. Although it wouldn't be a way of coming to Kant's defense, because he does want there to be an analytic synthetic distinction.
Yeah,
But perhaps you weren't intending the point to reach as far as that.
no, I was intending it to reach quite far, because, I mean, even if you think of, for example, arithmetic.
Yeah.
And the fact that, you know, what we have in our heads are, you know, that think about arithmetic.
Yeah.
Are, you know, they're finitistic devices of some sort. And you know, we can only envisage numbers up to such and such an extent. You know, say, you know, and yet we allow ourselves to talk about the natural numbers.
Yeah.
And, you know, there is no, you know, which is a concept for which there is no realization. We have a lot of approximations to it.
Yeah, well, of course, arithmetic raises huge questions as well for all the familiar reasons. And I mean, as far as Kant himself is concerned, questions that, as it were, are pushing in the other direction, because of course his own view is that there's good reason to regard the truths of arithmetic as synthetic.
Yeah.
Rather than as analytic. And
yeah. But you know, but I think if you went to a, you know, fully synthetic view about arithmetic, then you would run into all sorts of problems about whether, you know, if two people were talking about arithmetic to each other, whether they had exactly the same concepts of arithmetic.
Yes. No, I agree. I mean, these are fraught issues. I'm not totally persuaded by what you say about vixens, I must admit, but although I'm not particularly wedded to the analytic synthetic distinction either. I mean, I think you know, if you were able to convince me that there really was a problem about calling this an analytic truth, I think that I would see that as further cause for concern about the distinction. I mean, for what it's worth, my own views about these issues tend to be rather Wittgensteinian, and you can read Wittgenstein in such a way as to think that he's a kind of champion of a sort of analytic synthetic distinction. I mean, there is talk about, you know, rules of representation versus statements of empirical fact, and it can look a bit like an analytic synthetic distinction. But I think my own view is that closer scrutiny reveals him doing something really rather different. And the sorts of complications that you're raising may actually be music to Wittgenstein's ears.
Yes, I'm not sure at all. I mean, I don't know if how well defined he thought language games were.
Well, that's a good question,
which is pervasive.
Thank you for the question, Graham. Graham, we're going to have to move on just because of my understanding is that Adrian has a commitment in Oxford that he's going to have to attend to soon. So we want to get as many questions in as possible before then. But thank you very much. Yeah, I just want to say hi to James and Kadir and to Yuki. I saw you guys are in the chat. It'd be good to have a question from one of you guys if you're interested. But while other people are thinking about their questions, I see we have a question from Jim. Adrian, I want, if there's time for you to maybe say something about this idea of an absolute point of view, or in the sense in which that point of view, a view from nowhere, is possible in the course of undertaking philosophical inquiry. But let's turn to Jim And go ahead and feel free to ask your question. Thanks.
Hi, thanks very much, Adrian, for that. It's wonderful. And I guess my question, and I probably just need to make sure I've got it right, is about the end where you have the conditional. If there is synthetic armchair knowledge, then transcendental idealism is true. And I'm just wondering about how that in relation to, that's where a sort of internal incoherence, you think, from even Kant's own point of view, is inescapable at that point. So I was wondering about that, because you don't have any problem with the thinkability of the distinction between appearances and things in themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, say, where you have the antinomies and you have a kind of indirect proof. So all of this is allegedly, if he's right about all these things. So you have the faculties that we do have, and if you let them tick away endlessly, you get antinomies and so on. And so the thinkable distinction between things in themselves and appearances supposedly resolves various internal conflicts that generate among perfectly good faculties. And you could perhaps say the same thing about geometry and the supposed necessity in that case too. So I'm just wondering, does he really, I guess the problem's supposed to be that he's claiming synthetic a priori cognition or knowledge of things in themselves, in your view, because of the very argument that has the Kantian conditional.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if that's really so, or whether all he needs is that the thinkability of this distinction and maintaining that distinction, even though we can only go so far as to think in terms of it, resolves certain contradictions of internal conflicts of reason, and that he's not caught saying that we need to be able to know the things, synthetic knowledge of the sorts of things we can't have it of.
Yeah, an excellent question, Jim. Thanks so much. I also feel embarrassed because I think this is at least the second, possibly the third time that you've heard this.
Well, it's like watching a good movie, you know. I forget the plot and so on. It's nice to see it again.
But thanks for that question. I mean, one very striking feature of my talk, or a very striking feature for anybody that's familiar with recent translations of Kant's work into English, is the fact that I was talking throughout in terms of knowledge, not cognition. And of course, recently people have emphasized the importance of that distinction and the importance of the fact that Kant is concerned with whatever he means by erkenntnis. And I think that's going to be relevant to the answer to your question, although I probably don't have time to say quite how I think it's relevant, except just to say the following, which is that I'm quite deliberately couching these issues in terms of a broader and fairly intuitive conception of knowledge, not Kant's own sort of quasi-technical conception of cognition. Because the kind of knowledge that I think transcendental idealism yields, or the kind of knowledge that his arguments for transcendental idealism yield in his own terms, may well not count as examples of what he would call cognition. But I think do count as examples that should be problematical for him, that he should be worried by, because when all's said and done, there's an argument for transcendental idealism. There's what he himself takes to be a compelling, decisive argument for this conclusion. And if you've got a compelling, decisive argument for a conclusion, there's a question about the position that you're in at the end of the process of following that argument. And it's something that I think at the very least deserves to be called a state of knowledge, if not a state of cognition. And then it seems to me, my hope is that if we think that through, then we're up and running again and in a position to see that there's a kind of internal contradiction there. But you've also, I mean, your question has also fastened on another really interesting and crucial point, which is the conditional that I cited, that's at the bottom of the handout and that I cited towards the end of my paper. If there's synthetic armchair knowledge, then transcendental idealism is true. As you quite rightly point out, that's not the only conditional of this kind that Kant adheres to. He thinks there are other conditionals that have transcendental idealism as their consequence. And he is also going to want to say something to that effect about the antinomies. If thinking of the physical world as an unconditioned whole leads you into contradiction, then transcendental idealism is true. That's the explanation for why thinking in those terms leads you into contradiction, something along those lines. And so if I'm going to do a modus tollens in this case, I'm going to have to do it in these other cases as well. And it does follow that it behoves me, it would ultimately behove me to say something about where I think the arguments about the antinomies go wrong.
I just quick follow-up. It's a good question. What kind of knowledge is it? I mean, I think the view I was sort of gesturing toward would have to emphasize that philosophical knowledge for Kant is really analytical knowledge, not Vixen sort of analytical, but the way he puts it in the doctrine of method in terms of the analysis of certain faculties and
the analysis of faculties rather than concepts. Yeah.
So it could be you'd have. Yeah. I could say there is cognition, that's true, and so on. But I'm sympathetic to your view that there's important kinds of knowledge that, in the broad sense that he wants to defend, and I guess I'd have to lay a lot of emphasis on the consistency and coherence of reason being a big part of his story. And that's essentially philosophical analysis. So supposedly transcendental idealism, the thought of transcendental idealism resolves those conflicts.
Yeah. Before we go any further, Stephen, I told you that I had to leave promptly at past, and in fact, I can stay on for a little bit longer. I mean, only a little bit longer, but I don't have to rush straight away.
Oh, good. Well, that's good because we do have another question from the audience, which is apparently a follow-on to some of the things that Jim's been exploring. It's a question from Yuki. So I'll ask Yuki's question, and then if we have time left over, we'll see if anyone else has something left to ask.
Yeah, I'm also conscious, Stephen, of the fact that I still haven't said anything about your question about.
I want to ask that if there's time, but I also want to make sure that others have a chance to get questions in first. So I'll just hold that thought for now, and let's see. Let me turn to what Yuki had to say. So Yuki wrote, the thing that threatens Kant's transcendental idealism with incoherence seems to be his commitment to thoughts about things in themselves that are also cognitions. You mentioned the thought that God exists and the thought of the doctrine of transcendental idealism itself, but there's knowledge, cognition, and there's knowledge, cognition, and there's thought, and there's thought. Could Kant, and if not himself a Kantian, mitigate the threat of incoherence by appealing to a different kind of thought, cognition, knowledge than the kind that would give him incoherently the epistemic goods that transcendental idealism is designed to rule out. For instance, ineffable knowledge, knowledge whose content is not propositional, or what Kant sometimes calls practical cognition, the kind of epistemic relation we presumably have to the practical postulates.
Thanks, Yuki. That's such a good question. That's a really good question, and very directly related to the conversation that I was just having with Jim, of course, following on naturally from that. It is, in a way, I think, the question. I mean, is this how Kant might be defended? I have already conceded on Kant's behalf that the sheer idea of thought about things in themselves is no problem for him. There's no internal contradiction in him admitting such a thing. He's quite adamant that there can be no cognition of things in themselves, and if he was forced to admit that there was at least speculative cognition of things in themselves, that would indicate internal contradiction for him. But as it were, by my own admission in the exchange that I just had with Jim, what we're talking about here that I think does present a problem for him is somewhere between those two extremes. It's less than cognition and it's more than mere thought. And so Yuki's question, I guess, is, well, look, is it possible that there is intermediate territory here between the kind of cognition of things in themselves that definitely would be problematical for Kant and the kind of thought about things in themselves that is not problematical for him? Is there some intermediate territory for something that he's committed to, but that is nevertheless not problematical for him? And so that, I mean, that's just such a good question, and there's a lot that could be said about it. In this context, I think all I have to say is that the particular candidates on offer, for example, some kind of practical knowledge or some kind of ineffable knowledge, won't help him in this particular context, because I think if my argument in this paper is successful, then the kind of knowledge that we have as a result of following through the argument for transcendental idealism will quite clearly, I think, not be either of those. I mean, not ineffable, for example, because apart from anything else, we F it. There is, there's a statement of the position that we arrive at. There's a statement of transcendental idealism. Of course, there is also the possibility that it's just a purported statement of the kind of knowledge that we have, and Yuki knows very well that that's a suggestion that I personally would be very sympathetic to, but I don't think it's the kind of thing that Kant would want to say, and I don't think it's the kind of thing that would do justice to where Kant thinks his arguments for transcendental idealism take us. So this is all a very roundabout way of saying that although I think Yuki's question is excellent, and although I think it takes us to the heart of these issues, I'm not convinced that it's going to help Kant. in this particular context.
So with an eye to concluding, if others have questions that they wish to ask, now would be the time to do so. But I think I'll get around to asking my question about points of view. So it's been a few years since I read Points of View, but I do know that in your book on metaphysics, you get into this issue that Yuki's just mentioned regarding ineffability. And so I'm wondering whether you might just say some things about this metaphysical dispute about whether or not it's methodologically possible or feasible for finite creatures such as ourselves to think philosophically about reality, but from a point of view. In other words, is there a view from nowhere? And is it actually something that we should aspire to in thinking philosophically about reality, that we try to be, to adopt a point of view that is, as it were, a view from nowhere?
Well, I mean, it's a massive question, obviously, and I mean, I'd be only too pleased if I had the time to go on at enormous length about this. But let me just briefly say a couple of things. So yes, I do believe that it is possible for human beings to think about reality from no point of view, and perhaps even to acquire knowledge from no point of view. But I'm very, very much following Bernard Williams in this regard. I mean, the basic idea is one that appears in Bernard Williams's book on Descartes and elsewhere in Bernard's work, but that was the first place that it really became prominent. And I'm very beholden to his arguments, and in particular, my answer to your question, Stephen, is no, I don't think it's appropriate for philosophers to try to think about reality from no point of view. So yes, such a thing is possible, but it's the prerogative of scientists. The view from nowhere is a kind of scientific take on reality. And if physicists are successful in their endeavors, they may come by knowledge from no point of view. But the kind of exercise that we're engaged in, I do see as different. So that's the first thing to say in response to you. I mean, obviously, I'm not justifying that at all. That's just a statement of what I think. But to relate it to Kant, I mean, these are not particularly Kantian ways of thinking, though they're not particularly un-Kantian either. And one suggestion that emerges in this paper is that when Kant himself talks about things in themselves, there's a kind of what the medievals would have called a kind of syncategoricity that's at work here, that talking about knowledge or thought of things in themselves is just in effect a way of talking about knowledge or thought from no point of view. And of course, insofar as he takes himself to be doing any of that qua philosopher, then I am committed to thinking that's yet another problem for him, because I've just said that's, this is not the kind of thing to which philosophers can aspire. But then just yet another comment, just wrapping all of this up. You did also mention in your question, Stephen, this idea which Yuki also picked up on, that there may be a certain kind of knowledge that's ineffable. And that's an idea that I've tried to defend in a number of places. And part of the way in which that relates to this whole discussion is that I do think that there are cases in which we have what might be called ineffable knowledge, where there is also such a thing as the temptation to try to express it, and where there is also such a thing as the result of succumbing to that temptation. And one of the things that I think would result, is liable to result from succumbing to that temptation, is transcendental idealism. So there's a kind of diagnosis that ineffable knowledge can be put to use for.
Fantastic. I mean, the Heideggerian in me always loves to hear philosophers say they have room for ineffability. So, well, I want to thank you, Adrian, for taking the time to be with us today at the seminar. And I want to thank all the people in the audience for making the time to be here as well. I should say, just by way of concluding, that the seminar meets ordinarily once a month, but this month is unique in that we're going to have 2 talks. So in addition to today's talk with Adrian, on the 25th, we're going to have another talk on Kant with Emmanuel Faulk from Paris. So if you enjoyed today's talk, I very much encourage you to consider registering for that next one as well. Adrian, if you have any final comments you'd like to make, feel free to do so, or otherwise we can conclude there.
Well, I do just want to conclude with thanks, actually. A number of people have said thanks in the chat, and that's reciprocated. Thanks to everybody for attending, and thanks for some excellent questions, and thanks for the original invitation.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And as I mentioned, today's talk was recorded, so it'll be posted at the Woolf YouTube side. So if you want to watch this again later, or distribute it to colleagues and friends who may be interested who weren't able to attend live, by all means, please do so. All right, well, we'll let you run to your appointment in Oxford. Thank you so much, Adrian.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
All right, everybody have a good day. Thank you. Bye.